Hi. There's been a lot of talk, of course, about anti-Semitism since October 7th, and there has been, I think, clearly a rise of anti-Semitism, and I've talked about that before. But I also think that underneath this discussion of anti-Semitism are also dynamics among American Jews, inside the American Jewish community, that are sometimes obscured from view, that the media doesn't quite pick up on. And these are a kind of, I would say, an intra-Jewish civil war. The Civil War is partly generational, with younger American Jews often expressing views about Israel that are deemed anti-Semitic by major American Jewish organizations, for instance, supporting boycotting Israel or not supporting Israel as a Jewish state. But there's another divide, I think, kind of hidden divide inside the American Jewish community that is often overlooked, that gets described in the language of anti-Semitism. And that's a kind of a divide around class between different elements in the Jewish community that have different views about Israel and that are in different position in terms of class. And I want to try to give an example of how this is playing itself out. So after October 7th, the president of Harvard University, then President Claudine Gay, came under pressure to appoint kind of a committee to look into anti-Semitism at the campus. Now, this committee didn't have, almost nobody on the committee had any scholarly credentials in the study of anti-Semitism. What it did have was a whole group of people who had either said that they believed that anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism, which would be to say that a lot of the pro-Palestinian activism at Harvard was therefore anti-Semitic, and people who had ties to the Anti-Defamation League, which has said that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And that was a set of views that, although, again, none of these people really had scholarly credentials on this question, that made establishment American Jewish organizations happy and made many of the donors who were upset at Harvard, it made them happy. Then more recently, and I wrote a column in Jewish Currents about the absurdity of the fact that Harvard and these other universities were creating committees to study anti-Semitism on their campuses and often ignoring their own experts who studied anti-Semitism and going to choose people instead for these committees whose qualification was that they had views that were similar to the views of donors who were upset by pro-Palestinian activism. So, for instance, the University of Pennsylvania, when they created an anti-Semitism commission, the person who they named to head the committee was the head of the dental school. But interestingly, at Harvard, things have now taken a turn. So Claudine Gay was essentially pushed out. And now the interim president of Harvard has essentially scrapped that earlier anti-Semitism committee and created a new one. And its co-chair is a guy named Derek Pensler. Now, Derek Pensler runs Harvard Center for Jewish Studies. He's a professor of Israel studies, and he's one of the world's experts on both Zionism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism. Recently wrote a quite acclaimed book called Zionism: An Emotional State, which actually has a whole chapter on the different motivations of people who have hated Zionism since its founding in the late 19th century and the relationship between those different kinds of hostilities and anti-Semitism. So essentially, he is kind of the perfect person, right, to co-chair a committee on anti-Semitism at Harvard, because he's a world's expert not only in anti-Semitism, but on the relationship between Zionism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism. So what has happened? A furor has erupted in which big donors to Harvard, like Bill Ackman and establishment Jewish organizations, leaders like Abe Foxman, who ran the Anti-Defamation League, are furious that Pensler has been put in charge of this committee to study anti-Semitism because he's a critic of Israel. His criticisms are not radical by any means. In fact, I think he's very much in the mainstream of how scholars of anti-Semitism and scholars in Jewish studies tend to see Israel, which is to say, it's very, very mainstream for scholars of Jewish studies in the United States to be very critical of Israel and even to raise questions about Zionism itself. And the scholarly consensus among people who study anti-Semitism is generally that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. So the American Jewish establishment organizations in the Israeli government support a definition of anti-Semitism called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, which essentially does gesture towards the idea that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. But while this has a lot of mainstream institutional support in the Jewish community, it doesn't have very much support among scholars who actually study anti-Semitism. There are a bunch of scholars who've signed it, but if you look carefully, you'll find that actually it doesn't have very much support among scholars who actually study anti-Semitism and who study Israel-Palestine. A competing definition, which is the one that Penzler has supported, which is called the Jerusalem Declaration, which doesn't claim that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism, has much more support among scholars of Jewish studies and scholars of anti-Semitism. But the problem is that those scholars have a view that is very different than many of the large Jewish donors that are pressuring these universities, and views that are very different from the establishment Jewish organizations. So when a university responds to the question of anti-Semitism by drawing on the expertise of its own scholars of anti-Semitism, rather than assuaging Jewish organizations and donors, it infuriates them. And this is because there is a kind of a class divide, I would say, you could say, among American Jews between a group of scholars, right, who study these things, whose views are really quite different in the main from the Jewish organizations and the donors. And it's important to remember that very often it is large donors that dictate the perspectives of American Jewish organizations. So there's a kind of a class divide, you could almost say, that exists among American Jews in addition to this generational divide. And I would say it is between the kind of donor class, the donors to universities, and a donor class that wields tremendous influence in organized American Jewish organizations that wants to define anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism, and a kind of scholarly class, an intellectual class that you find actually doing Jewish studies at universities that actually doesn't generally believe that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. And that's the conflict you have now over the appointment of Derek Penzler. It's kind of a hilarious little footnote is that Alan Dershowitz recently called for universities to disband their Jewish studies departments. Now, why would Alan Dershowitz call for universities to disband their Jewish studies departments? Presumably, he thinks that studying Judaism and Jewish history and Jewish culture is a good thing. No, he thinks that he says we need to disband the Jewish studies departments because he believes that they've become hotbeds of anti-Semitism, right? Which is just his own way of saying these scholars who study Jewish history, who study Jewish studies, who study anti-Semitism, don't actually come to the political conclusions that we would like. And that's the situation that we're facing now in this new little controversy around Derek Penzler's appointment. And it's another test for these universities, right? Are they going to stand up for their own scholarly mission, or are they going to bow to pressure from donors and from outside groups who, although they're speaking in the name of what they claim is good for Jews, right, or is in the interest of Jews, they're actually in active opposition to empowering the very people who have spent their lives devoted to the scholarly study of anti-Semitism, like Derek Penzler. I hope to see many of you on our call this Friday, and the information is in the email about our guests.